Okay, welcome everybody. It's great to be here at the 20th Oxford Media Convention. I may be one of the few people who's actually in Oxford today. I'm speaking to you from Oxford, and I may also be one of the few people who's attended every single one of the Oxford Media Conventions. I have survived, as you can see. I don't know if it's a blessing or not. Happy Freedom Day, by the way. I'm delighted to be joined by the Right Honourable John Whittingdale, who I'm going to introduce briefly. I couldn't think of anybody more appropriate to enlighten us today on the theme of the conference. The theme is Reform Media, Renew Democracy. And we've heard already today from Melanie Dawes, CEO of Ofcom, and she has reviewed quite a lot of evidence about problems of trust in the media and trust in the media and democracy more generally. And I guess just to pick up some of the points that Melanie made, there is a lot of discussion recently about a potential crisis of democracy and a crisis of trust in democracy and the role of media and media policy in that. And I guess I would somewhat differ to Melanie's position in that I probably think there's more of a problem of trust and more of a problem of trust in the media than she thinks, having reviewed some of Ofcom's own research and other research like the Edelman Trust Barometer. So this is not the time for a long discussion, and I think it might be a question of my cup half full and Melanie's cup half empty. But I'd be really intrigued if we can in some way engage with this question of the wider context to all of these debates as when we have this discussion today, John. John Whittingdale has done all of the jobs that really matter in this area. He was Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport from 2015 to 2016. He has also chaired the Select Committee on Culture, Media and Sport, and he is currently Minister of State with responsibility for media and a very long list of other things, which I'm sure he is happy to speak about. He has done many other things, I read. And John, if I can start in maybe a slightly distant territory, but I'm sure you'll see why. I noticed that you were awarded the Order of Merit for Ukraine a couple of years ago in connection with your work for the OSCE and other roles, I think. And we don't have time to go into the whole story, obviously, but I wonder what your view is on the role of misinformation and so-called information warfare in the period of annexation of the Ukraine.
Well, Damien, that's a fascinating question, and one which I wasn't necessarily expecting when I saw you were going to be moderating this session, but I'm very happy to talk about it. I mean, I've had a very long-standing interest in Ukraine. I chaired the Ukraine All-Party Parliamentary Group following visits with the Interparliamentary Union, and I was there under Yanukovych, and then I witnessed the Maidan revolution, which removed him and installed democratic government. And then, of course, shortly after that, there was the invasion of Crimea and the disruption in the east of Ukraine. And you're right that Russian interference in Ukraine has taken many forms. In its most obvious, it is physical military assault, which took place in Crimea, and the arming of separatists in the east. But there was definitely an element of that which was disinformation. It's what's known as hybrid warfare. You deploy every tactic. And part of it, of course, in Ukraine, and we could spend a lot of time talking about Ukraine, but in Ukraine, the media is owned by political interests. So, you know, the concept of a fair and impartial and objective news provider is somewhat distant from them. And also, in the east of Ukraine, it is predominantly Russian television. And Russian television was relentless in setting out a narrative that what was the removal of a corrupt authoritarian dictator and his replacement by a much more democratic regime was in fact a kind of Nazi takeover. They attempted to portray the government in Kiev as essentially a far-right imposition, even though there was no evidence for that. But the result was that people living in the East who could only receive Russian television believed it implicitly and thought that they were all going to be slaughtered. And it was a very dramatic example of the power of disinformation and the importance of having reliable, trustworthy professional journalism. And I went and gave interviews mainly to online or radio media, and the BBC World Service was supporting some in order to try and counter the Russian disinformation. And it's one of the reasons why I've always been a very strong supporter of the BBC World Service. We have an incredible asset in the World Service that people trust.
That's really impressive, and I agree with a lot of that analysis. And I also agree with what you said about the importance of these changes in the security situation in which particularly democracies, and particularly vulnerable fledgling democracies like the Ukraine, find themselves in. And I think it's reflected in the government's defence review. And I think if you look at the integrated defence review, you'll see that issues of information warfare, as well as cybersecurity, and the resilience of democracies and democratic values have become very much more important in the defence, foreign and security policy of the country. And now, if we could get back to the theme of the conference, I would be interested to see how you think that changes, or maybe doesn't change, domestic media policy. Do policymakers need to be more proactive in protecting democratic value, the resilience of journalism, and media more widely?
Yes, for a number of reasons. I mean, it was already the case that professional journalism and media was under terrific threat as a result of the transition to digital and the disruption that was caused. So traditional publishers have been struggling for a long time. They've been losing subscribers, they've been losing advertisers, and the power of the platforms has been increasing. So that was something I was aware of even before I sort of arrived, because as you say, I worked on it when I was at Select Committee. And the broadcasters too are facing competition from a huge range of people. But of course, then we had COVID. And the past sort of year, 15 months has shown the importance of having reliable, trusted information. It's not just disinformation that is powered by hostile states, of which there is plenty around, but equally it is the sort of completely unmoderated hysteria that reigns on social media. And at a time when we have been combating the pandemic, it has been absolutely essential to get across reliable facts. So we started off the pandemic trying to persuade people that it wasn't caused by 5G mobile telephone masts, which you could read at great length on social media. And of course, that has now been overtaken by the need to counter the disinformation about vaccines. And there's also some who still claim that COVID doesn't really exist, or if it does, it's no worse than a sort of like mild dose of flu. All of this is out there. And I've always said that the best counter to fake news, to disinformation, is reliable journalism. And that isn't just...
Can I come in on that point? Because I mentioned that one of the things that Melanie Dawes, the CEO of Ofcom, drew on this morning was the Edelman Trust Barometer. So opinion survey-based data on trust in various institutions, including the media. And all of these survey-based measures, they have their caveats and problems in the data. They need to be taken carefully. But one thing, when I had a quick look at it, leapt out at me, and I was wondering about your view on it. The last time that Edelman ran a survey on trust in public news media versus trust in private news media, they found something really interesting. So in the United Kingdom, when asked in a survey, 17% of respondents said that they trusted private news media more than public news media, and 71% said they trusted public news media more than private news media. Now, obviously, lots of caveats around this, but this is something that comes back in various surveys over a long period of time, that people tend to trust public news media, and that we have, in comparison with other countries, we have some rather well-trusted media outlets. If you compare, for example, to the US, levels of trust in public news media are reasonably healthy. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I think to some extent it depends what definitions you use. I mean, I cite you a similar survey recently of television news providers, which showed that in terms of trust, the BBC was not first. It was I think third or fourth. And actually, I think if you said to people what is a public news provider and what is a private, people would perhaps struggle in some instances. We do have a completely different system in this country, where obviously broadcast news providers are all subject to the Ofcom impartiality requirements. And I do strongly believe in having a range of different voices. I think a single state-owned news provider would be very damaging. I'm a huge admirer from the BBC, but I don't just want people to have to rely on the BBC. That's why we support ITN, it's why we support Sky News, and why I welcome the advent of GB News and indeed any others who seek to join. In terms of print media, again, obviously we don't have the same regulation, but we do have a vast range of voices and people can choose. But generally, I think that people trust UK news providers, certainly the more established ones. And one of the other areas where another survey I saw recently showed that the publications which people trust most are actually their local publications. Local newspapers are trusted more, maybe because people feel that they are sort of part of their community, they identify with them more, which is another reason why sustaining local newspapers is so incredibly important. And they are bearing, they're in the sort of front line of this war against the sort of platforms and the challenges that publishers are facing, and we are doing what we can to support local newspapers. And actually, they are adapting. There are some new models emerging which are doing relatively well, but this is an incredibly disruptive time for all media, and I mean, you know that more than I.
I wasn't sure, John. I mean, I welcome the point about local media, and I agree with them. I wasn't sure whether you were disputing this finding that public news media are more trusted than private news media. Are you?
Are you saying? But what exactly do you mean that, Matt? Do you mean that the BBC is trusted more because it's state-owned as against ITN because it happens to have shareholders?
No, I think the survey question would have been a very simple survey question on do you trust public media on a 9-point scale versus do you trust private media on a 9-point scale? And presumably they take a certain amount of care and in the way that these surveys are constructed. And I think the point I started off with is that we can have an endless debate about data about trust. And I think we can be frank. We are speaking across the political divide here, but we're both. I was a former advisor to the previous government, but we're both part of political parties that believe in protecting democracy. And there's a real need in this moment for cross-party, thoughtful institution building, given not only long-term questions around trust in democracy, but those questions actually being manifest in a changed security environment. So I guess what I'm interested in is, can we get beyond a kind of a slightly ding-dong battle about, public good, private bad on both sides, the reverse, etc., to a debate where you have a discussion about long-term institution buildings to protect democracy, whether you think that that is a goer.
Well, I mean, I think the challenges have changed dramatically in the last few years, and it's all due to the advent of the platforms and the power they hold. And I mean, if we go back sort of 10 years and everybody was worried about whether or not Rupert Murdoch was too powerful because he happened to own 4 newspapers and a big chunk of Sky. I mean, he no longer owns a big chunk of Sky, and print newspapers are less influential than they were. And even in his day, I mean, there was still a broad range both of broadcasters and of printed newspapers. Today, the power rests with the platforms. And whereas I've always believed in plurality and allowing people, the maximum number of viewpoints to choose between, the difficulty now is that you have a small number of very powerful companies that are exercising censorship to some extent. And so that takes me to the online safety bill, which we are, as you know, about to introduce into Parliament. And one of the things that we were very keen to do, and I've spent a lot of time talking to the media about this, is to ensure that journalistic content is protected. Because at the moment, if Mark Zuckerberg or one of his people decides that they don't like that particular viewpoint, they remove it and there's nothing you can do about it. And there is no special recognition of the importance of journalism. So what we are trying to do is to put in place protections. We want to protect freedom of speech generally, but we want to go beyond that and give special protection to journalistic content. Now, that then, of course, leads on to lots of questions about how you define it, and that's something which, your previous speaker, Melanie, is going to have to sort of wrestle with, because Ofcom are going to have to play the part. But we are absolutely clear that we want to protect journalistic content of whatever viewpoint, but as long as it is professionally produced, against the existing position, which is both the economic and the political power of the platforms.
I note that you welcome the fact that Ofcom, that is an independent regulator, is dealing with those sensitive questions of defining news for the purpose of the journalistic exemption, and there's a lot of work to do there. But there are other areas where freedom of expression and media freedom and media independence become quite difficult in the online harms bill. So, for example, definitions of harm, and Ofcom will be, to some extent, involved in developing codes of conduct, which will define what is harmful content, and developing procedures and standards for saying when platforms are doing enough to deal with not only harmful content, but also illegal content. One of the criticisms that has come from those commenting on online harms is that Ofcom might not be sufficiently independent. And another is that this will result in a chilling effect. So, for example, an example given is blasphemy, and whether blasphemy could be reintroduced by the back door because it's seen as a form of harmful content within those definitions. How can you guard against those kinds of things, and how can you protect the independence of Ofcom and the whole system?
Well, it isn't Ofcom in the first instance that is making these decisions. I mean, Parliament is going to set down of some categories of what we deem to be harmful content, but it won't be exclusive. And it will be for the platforms themselves to have transparent and clear policies. We're not saying to the platforms, you have to carry this particular piece if it goes against your terms and conditions, and you're entitled to set your own terms and conditions. These are, they're individual companies who all have their own policies. What we have said is, firstly, that they have to be transparent as to what their terms are, and that they need to give due regard to freedom of expression within that. There will be a duty to recognise the importance of freedom of expression alongside the duty of care, which they will have to remove harmful material. And that process is overseen by Ofcom. So Ofcom will have the job of making sure that the platforms are following those rules, that they have terms and conditions. Now, in terms of something like blasphemy, I mean, there will be platforms which may decide that they don't, that they have a religious orientation, which means that they don't want to have contributions which go against that. And if that is very clear in their terms and conditions, they say, look, this is the viewpoint we represent, then as long as they apply them properly, then it is their entitlement. Now, the biggest platforms are subject to sort of greater protections and strategic market significance, and those are the ones which Ofcom will be primarily overseeing. But as I say, there is a core requirement that freedom of expression is properly regarded. And the other part of it is that if you post something which is removed by Facebook or by Twitter or whoever as being a breach, and you don't think it is a breach, then you have a right to appeal or challenge. And I can give you two very recent examples where that is intensely relevant. I mean, we had the most recent one of The Sun, who put up on their YouTube channel a long broadcast of a Donald Trump speech in which he said, well, of course, everybody knows this election was won by dead people voting. And there was a view that The Sun should have qualified that broadcast by saying, this is Donald Trump's view, there is actually no evidence whatsoever that dead people were voting. And that is an area where we are in discussion, but The Sun would rightly be covered by the journalistic content. Now, whether or not they should have qualified it is another matter, but they should have that protection. And then the one before that, which you may also remember, was the talk radio incident, where again YouTube struck them out as a result of an interview where they'd had somebody on who was a COVID denier, but was actually challenged in the interview, and Google, I think, admitted that was wrongly an interpretation. But these are not theoretical cases. It is actually happening where journalistic content is being taken down by platforms, and so the importance of having that protection is very clear.
But the intention, and I know we're at early stages, is that there will be a way of, if you like, exempting a thing called journalistic or news content from the more onerous regulatory requirements of the online safety regime. And part of that will be about that definition. It seems to be, I think, somewhere in the legislation, a definition which says, if you are subject to an ethical code of some kind, whether that's the IPSO code or the Impress code or some other kind of journalistic code, that will help define that you're qualified for the exemption.
I mean, the first thing is that we're still fashioning this, and it's about to go through pre-legislative scrutiny. You're right that the challenge of setting a set of criteria which captures a cross-section of reputable, legitimate journalism, but doesn't create a loophole that can be exploited by, publications that actually are vehicles for promotion of, child abuse or extremist jihadist content. We don't want this to be abused, but equally, you don't want to confine it just to, very well-known publications. So, whether or not you would need to be a member of a regulatory body, I mean, there are several newspapers that are not. The FT is not, the Guardian is not, the Independent is not. So that won't necessarily work. There will be a variety of criteria, to do with the extent to which editorial oversight is conducted, about the extent to which there is a variety of opinion, etc. That these are matters which are very important, but which will be subject to debate as the bill goes through Parliament. But we are clear that we want to give protection to legitimate journalistic content, but we don't want to create a sort of wide gaping door that any extremist can exploit.
Okay, we've spoken a bit about the negative side, if you like, what to do about bad speech. Let's move on a little bit about to how to promote quality journalism and speech that supports democracy and supports trust broadly. insofar as we can define it. Part of that is exemptions to the former regime, the safety regime. But there are a couple of questions coming through about other issues. So Ken Cross recommended extending the tax breaks regime for quality journalism. Are you still working on that? For example, zero rating for VAT?
Well, I mean, the truth is, we are very keen to support local newspapers, and there's a variety of vehicles which you can use. I mean, tax breaks are very difficult because at the end of the day, it requires the Treasury to be convinced, and particularly at the moment, the Treasury are not particularly receptive to ideas of reducing the tax intake even further. So, I mean, I do think that there are interesting ideas. I've talked to, some of the publishers about that. And I have to give credit to the Treasury. They have been very supportive in terms of some of the measures to help publishers through the pandemic. Things like business rates relief and also the public information campaign, which was in order to get messaging across, but nevertheless,
I think the proposal for VAT was, I think we're talking about very small numbers. It was to extend the exemption to online versions.
Oh, well, that we did. No, and that's happened. I mean, actually, not one of the things we did right at the start of the pandemic was to bring forward the zero rating of e-publications, which was due to come in later in the year anyway, but the Treasury agreed. I mean, you're right, it's probably not the biggest contributor to the Treasury's overall budget, but nevertheless, for electronic publishers, it was very significant. So, I mean, we were able to do that. But there have been other suggestions around for tax relief to support recruitment of journalists or various other worthy causes. But at the moment, it is not easy to extend the tax reliefs further than they are at present.
Can I come on to Channel 4? We had the last panel in the convention today. We had Helen Jay representing Channel 4. And one of the questions I think she put, which is a great place to start, is what is the problem that privatising Channel 4, and I think the government in the consultation document effectively says it's minded to change the ownership structure of Channel 4. What is the problem that this would solve?
The problem this will solve, potentially, if this is the route we choose, is the fact that Channel 4's model, whilst it has sustained it in a world where there was a limited number of channels to choose from, that it is becoming steadily less sustainable. Channel 4 is solely dependent on advertising revenue. And it is coming up against more and more competition as more and more streaming services become available. And therefore, inevitably that is going to have an impact on the number of people who watch Channel 4 because there is so much more choice out there, which has an impact on its advertising revenue. At the same time, the advertising revenue has been under terrific pressure. I mean, obviously because of the pandemic. I'm afraid the government is about to add to the pressure by restricting advertising of unhealthy foods, for instance. So for a variety of reasons, if you look at Channel 4's accounts that have just been published, they have come through the pandemic relatively well by cutting back on content spend. But this is a problem which is going to grow. And therefore, the reason for having the consultation now is to put Channel 4 into a position where it is going to be able to withstand those challenges moving forward.
Can I therefore put to you one of the comments in the questions submitted by one of our viewers, Robin Callender-Smith, who says the consultation document on Channel 4 privatisation says a privatised Channel 4 would have better access to capital, but Channel 4's current owner, the UK government, has better and cheaper capital market access than any potential acquirer. So why would privatising Channel 4 improve its access to capital?
Because
why not just increase its borrowing limit?
But because we have a massive deficit, which we have accumulated rightly in order to fight the pandemic. But if you talk to the Chancellor, he will tell you that reducing that deficit is absolutely central to the government's economic strategy. And whilst Channel 4 is in public ownership, its borrowing counts as public sector deficit. Therefore, Channel 4 is not allowed to borrow without the agreement of the Treasury, and it won't get it. So, not only is it not able to borrow, it also has no resources of its own other than, that which it gets from advertising. So, as I say, we are looking at a variety of different options, but just, one would be to have an owner who had the resources able to invest going forward. And also, by no longer being in public ownership, it is no longer constrained in terms of its borrowing. It can go out and borrow, but I'm afraid that particularly now, it cannot borrow under public ownership.
Thank you. I've been told that we're running out of time. I've also been told earlier that if we go 1 or 2 minutes over, I think that's fine. So you'll have time to wrap up, John. But I'd like to thank you for your full and frank answers. I want to just kind of step back to where we started the conversation a little bit. And it would have been nice to discuss all of the other things in your inbox to do with future of the BBC and all of the other issues. But in terms of the resilience of democracy and trust in democracy, obviously these kinds of decisions, although each one of them might seem more technical and rather kind of abstract, they all feed into questions about how healthy our democracy is, how people trust the information they receive, and our citizenship. Whether I as a citizen feel like I have the information necessary for me to be a good and effective citizen. Do you think there might be any kind of an issue with the way we do media policy? I mean, I've been observing and studying media policy for some time now, and I don't know if I'm a little bit of a golden ager when I hark back to thinking about when big issues like the Royal Commissions on the Press, like the various commissions in the 100 years or so of the history of the BBC, they were done in quite a formal and reflective way. It was explicitly cross-party. It was very transparent. We saw, I'm sure, Jean Seaton, who may still be listening, the historian of the BBC, was on a panel earlier, and I'm sure she will have views on whether I'm being golden ageist about this. But I think we saw that they were designed so that we did media policy in a way that protected trust in democracy. So it was harder for people to say that you're tinkering here and there in the media system, or in ways that go on in other countries which have a less trusted media, maybe favour the private media you described in the Ukraine, which is not very well trusted and much more easily manipulable. So I guess that to close, I'll ask two questions really. Do we need to think about how we do media policy and foster trust in the decisions that ministers like you take, so that people are more convinced that they're not favouring one section of the media over another? Because you mentioned harking back to the days of Murdoch. I think it's the same problem in a way. Yes, his titles have become less influential, but we're still dealing with the relationship between private concentrations of gatekeeper power in the information ecology, which undermine trust and legitimacy in democracy. So that's the first question. Do we need to think about how we do media policy differently? Is there more of a scope for fostering trust? And the other question is whether, in terms of resilience to information threats and the resilience of democracy itself, whether, for example, we need to think about ownership models in a different way, whether having one publicly owned broadcaster is necessarily going to be less resilient than having two. Maybe there's a benefit to having public service competition, and maybe having fewer public service broadcasters when public service broadcasters are more trusted than other broadcasters might not be the best thing to do.
I think you are being golden ageist. I mean, I think you are ignoring the revolution that is taking place, and it's taking place at two levels, and both are more disruptive than anything that you or I have ever seen during our time looking at media policy. The first is what is happening locally, where the challenge is to try and sustain any media at all. At the moment, there are swathes of this country where essentially local journalism has disappeared. And that is a massive threat to democracy. It means that what is happening in council chambers and health authorities and police authorities, etc., is going unreported, it's going unscrutinized. And that's something which I'm really concerned about. It's why we created the local democracy reporting scheme with the BBC, which is just a tiny part of trying to address that problem, and why we are looking to try and support new models emerging. And there are some really interesting new models. And then you have what is happening at a national and indeed international level, which is the platforms. And the platforms not only are undermining the economics of the media in a way that all...
John, you've muted yourself, I think. I think you've muted yourself. So I lost the audio briefly there, John. Apologies. It may just be me.
Sorry, did I...
Your sound just stopped, but it was just the last 30 seconds. It was a shame because you were just...
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Damien, I'm not sure how much of that you heard, and I can't hear you.
We just missed the last 1 minute or so, John. Can you hear me?
Damien, can you hear me?
I'm really sorry, John.
I can't hear you.
Now. I can hear you, John. So if you can just recap and just goodbye.
Damien, I think I've got you back again.
Okay. Apologies.
Not sure how much of that you got before I disappeared or was cut off.
Well, I have apologies for that. These things happen. I lost the last 1 minute or so. I'm not sure at what point the audience lost either of us and how much of that they heard. But if you could just...
Yeah, the last minute, what I wanted to say was what is happening nationally is and internationally is a huge...
Sorry, you've gone again. You've gone again, I'm afraid.
Am I back again?
Yes.
Right. Perhaps our most important intervention is that of the creation of the Digital Markets Unit, because it is a question of trying to ensure that we have properly functioning competition. And we've always had, a very competitive media market. But at the moment, you have a small number of people who are essentially controlling what people are able to access if they are getting their news online, and more are doing so. So, I mean, I think in terms of what we are doing to try and support media, if you go and talk to any of the players, they will tell you that actually that is the most important challenge. And it's one which is not just the UK. Your governments right across the world are looking at this. It was part of our G7 presidency. You've had the Australians obviously adopting some rather dramatic interventions, but every country is having to face this challenge.
Thank you very much, John, for your time this afternoon and for those wide-ranging and frank contributions. It's been a pleasure. I hope the audience have enjoyed it as much as I have, and hopefully